Hello everyone, and welcome to an overview of Sword and Sorcery.
Watching.
Okay, so why am I doing an overview of Sword and Sorcery? Well, aside from the fact that I don't think it's a genre that gets enough love, the other reason why is because I want to do a talk about one of my favorite tabletop RPGs, Barbarians of Lemuria. And I'll probably intersperse some pictures throughout this, but Barbarians of Lemuria is a Sword and Sorcery game, so it might be a bit weird to do an overview of that without going into what Sword and Sorcery is first. So, Sword and Sorcery is a genre of fantasy, created at first by Robert E. Howard. I'm pretty sure he's the one who created it. There might be that there's someone else who was involved in its creation. Well, obviously a lot more people than him were involved in its creation and codification, but Robert E. Howard was one of the big early creators of it, possibly like one of the big first creators of it, possibly even the original creator of it. And the creator of it, okay, anyway, Sword and Sorcery, so it's
during the year of the Cobra, a prisoner captured by unknown means was transported into the exiled lands, crucified, and left to die for crimes that they may or may not have committed. Death comes swiftly on black wings,
basically the one who
until
was the archetype
fate
for the fantasy
intervenes.
barbarians. But Conan was not Robert E. Howard's first Sword and Sorcery character. If I remember right, that was King Cole, who was an Atlantean who preceded Conan by quite a while, being part of the Third Age, which was prior to the Hyborian Age. Now, basically, Robert E. Howard's works weren't really set in a fantasy world as we think of it, though I suppose that it is kind of like Lord of the Rings. Lord of the Rings is basically an ancient myth that happens before.
Are you thirsty, dead woman? Shall I cut you down from that corpse tree?
Yeah, while Conan saves
It might kill you.
And actually, this is probably going to be some flashbacks.
You civilized
because
women are
something
soft.
similar to this happened to Conan.
Your lives are not nailed to your spines.
Anyway, Sword and Sorcery was a genre created by Robert E. Howard, who was a friend of H.P. Lovecraft's. The first age was the Thurian Age, which was then followed by... Sorry, not the first age. The first
Where I
age took
come
place in
from,
the
we
Thurian
kill our
Age,
enemies in
before the
battle.
Hyborian Age
We
of
don't
Conan.
leave them in the desert to die like
And,
dogs.
yeah, this dialogue is pretty spot on.
So,
It's like a lot
you
of
live again, dead woman.
Anyway, so basically the original Sword and Sorcery was
This land does not love men.
predecessor sort of to our era, a fictional era. of
You
history.
are marked.
That being said,
You cannot
it's
cross the
entirely
ghost
possible
fence
to have
wearing that.
Sword and Sorcery that takes place in a fantasy world.
It
And the
might have
original
been
Dungeons
kinder
and
to
Dragons
leave you on
was
the
Sword and
cross.
Sorcery. Or at least was Sword and Sorcery influenced heavily or to an extent.
Live. Love. Burn with life. Slay and survive.
Good idea, Conan.
We will meet again, dead woman.
Different fantasy genres, okay, while also being its own thing. So, to give an example, Sword and Sorcery is... Okay, maybe that's a bit too quiet. Okay, so Sword and Sorcery tends to be a genre of low fantasy. I tend to define it by tone, but define low fantasy by tone. But a lot of people might define low fantasy as fantasy where the fantasy elements are rare, or at least not commonplace. Think Game of Thrones as an example. Think of Game of Thrones as an example. There aren't many fantasy elements in Game of Thrones. They're few and far between. And where they do exist, they are, well, somewhat rare and underplayed. However, Sword and Sorcery isn't exactly that either. So, Sword and Sorcery, magic is typically rare in Sword and Sorcery, but that doesn't mean it's weak. Like, for example, let's say that Melisandre, who's a powerful sorcerer from Game of Thrones, were to fight, say, Thoth Amon from Conan. It would be absolutely one-sided. Like, Melisandre would get her ass kicked, and Thoth Amon wouldn't have even tried. Like, to give it, like, sorcerers in Sword and Sorcery, magic is rare in Sword and Sorcery. However, while it is rare, let's see, it isn't necessarily weak. So, to give an example, in one of to give some examples, there's a spellcaster who rips someone's heart out from his body in one of the Conan stories. And I don't mean he, like, does it up close. I mean that he basically takes Conan's that he basically holds out his hand and then draws the guy's heart out from his body. Just fucking extracts the thing with magic, sends it flying out of it. You also have sorcerers doing classic fantasy magic that you might find in high fantasy. For example, you have a sorcerer in the Scarlet Citadel shooting a fireball, and I'm going to use Conan for a lot of these examples because there's a reason why Howard is like the definitive first Sword and Sorcery writer. Like, there are some very clear reasons for this. But anyway, so a sorcerer in the Scarlet Citadel shoots fireballs. You also have another sorcerer in the same story using necromancy to reanimate a corpse. And I could go on. Like, in Sword and Sorcery, there are plenty of examples of powerful wizards doing high fantasy stuff, and stuff typically associated with high rather than low fantasy. And you can run Sword and Sorcery with like a high fantasy setting. Yeah, you could have absolute high fantasy, high magic, Sword and Sorcery.
We were forced to take refuge before the wind scoured the skin from our faces.
It might be less common than to have it in low fantasy. And actually, Barbarians of Lemuria, which I brought up, is a bit more is a bit more like high fantasy. Because it takes place in a fantasy world where there are all sorts of creatures running around a common place. To the point where your average person won't be riding around on a horse, but on basically a dinosaur or some weird mythical creature. And that is perfectly fine for Sword and Sorcery. It's generally low fantasy, but it doesn't have to be. Now, then we have another question, for example. So, so give an example of another question, then. Alright, I think a better way to think of Sword and Sorcery is to think of it as, rather than magic that is just low, think of it as sort of like a story, a paranormal investigation story, if that, like, makes sense. Magic in general civilization in Sword and Sorcery is generally low. There might be some sorcerers hanging about, but they're generally more hiding their abilities, or at least doing stuff in the background. Okay, generally speaking, in Sword and Sorcery, when you have a supernatural thing, generally speaking, civilization, sorcerers are like in the background and such. They're doing stuff, but they're doing it quietly. And, however, there are some supernatural hotspots, so to speak, with, like, where you will find far more common magic, far more monsters. Like, you could go from a normal being in, like, a normal human civilization, hanging out with a bunch of people, most of whom don't even believe in magic, or if they've seen it from a distance, don't really have much to say about it. And then, all of a sudden, you find yourself in then on a journey, you travel into some jungle. And in that jungle, you encounter a temple full of lizard men. And these lizard men have a powerful sorcerer king as their leader who can summon demons like it's nothing. An extreme example, perhaps, but that's the sort of thing you can encounter in this genre. Magic can be very high, but when it is high, it's typically high in specific areas that are in out-of-the-way places. Or perhaps in certain sorcerer kingdoms, where there are all sorts of evil wizards, Now, the nature of magic itself is also important to the Sword and Sorcery genre. Because, like, to the point where some people have classified the genre as swords against sorcery. I wouldn't quite go that far, but I don't think that's necessarily a wrong way to think of it. Basically, magic in Sword and Sorcery is typically evil. Now, that's not to say that 100% all magic is evil. Even in Howard's Conan stories, where magic is almost always depicted in a negative light, there still are exceptions. And by exceptions, I mean, like, two. For example, there is like white magic that's used in The Phoenix and the Sword, the first Conan story, to give Conan a weapon capable of slaying demons, or at least capable of doing it easily. There also is another example of it where the Tower of the Elephant. The titular elephant, which is actually basically a sort of benevolent Lovecraftian horror. Howard and Lovecraft were friends, and Conan is canon to the Cthulhu mythos. But anyway, in the Tower of the Elephant, the titular elephant basically mentions that it only tried to teach a sorcerer white magic, and it actually has taught other people white magic. Okay, so white magic does exist. Like, there is good magic in Sword and Sorcery. And there are some Sword and Sorcery protagonists who are users of magic. Like, for example, Elric of that place I don't know how to pronounce. He was a spellcaster who also fought with a sword. And you can probably find other examples, but good magic is a thing in Sword and Sorcery. However, it is the exception. Most sorcerers aren't really interested in good magic, or if they are, they aren't interested in just learning it. And they will invariably start practicing evil magic too. You know, where's that? Oh yeah, so sorcerers in Sword and Sorcery, most of them are evil. Like, when you encounter a sorcerer, you can pretty much bet and be right most of the time that he's up to something bad. Conan himself doesn't trust magic or those who practice it at all, and he's by and large right. There was actually a story, The Scarlet Citadel, where Conan has to team up with a sorcerer. And it's made clear that while they're on the same side, that sorcerer that Conan teams up with is evil. Good. Like, absolutely 100% evil. And like, Conan himself is so creeped out by the guy that after the story's over, Conan's basically like, yeah, he wasn't that bad for a sorcerer, but I hope I never meet him again. Yeah, like, so yeah, Conan doesn't exactly have a great encounter with him. So yeah, though that's another aspect of Sword and Sorcery. Most, though not necessarily all, magic is evil. And, well, a big part of Howard's stories, Sword and Sorcery stories specifically, not all of the, not every, not every Sword and Sorcery story has this theme, but a big theme of Howard's is the hypocrisy of civilization, and the idea that sometimes civilized people aren't necessarily any better than barbarians. And barbarians, in some cases, are better than them. Like, one of the examples in story that illustrates this is the story Rogues in the House. Basically, Conan is trapped in a house by an ape man, and he's trapped in there with two people, both of them basically politicians. One of them is a politician who's been holding the city in the reign of terror by pretending to be its sorcerer. This is actually one of the cases where, despite the guy being an evil antagonist, he isn't really a sorcerer, he's basically just pretending to be one, using essentially magic tricks. Conan at this point can't really tell the difference between magic tricks and actual magic. This, like, takes place fairly early in Conan's journeys. And the other politician is basically selling... Sorry, not basically. The other politician is selling state secrets to their enemies. And at the end of it, they all agree that between the three of them, Conan is the least evil. Because while he might be a like, raider, savage, thief, barbarian guy, he's at least not pretending to be anything else. He's at least not tricking people into thinking he's something he's not. He's not, like, pretending to be a nice guy when he's really evil. He's honest about what he is. Now, I'm also going to use an example in real life that that can be seen as a bit like that. So, in this case, it's the example of Alaric and Honorius. So, to sum it up, Honorius was one of the last and worst Roman emperors. Alaric was a king of the Visigoths. Though he wasn't a king at first, he was most likely a noble who served as a commander in the Roman army. And Honorius promised along with the Romans in general, promised the Visigoths that if they fought for the Roman armies for a certain amount of time, they'd be given a lot of land. And after the Goths passed, and, like, I'm going to simplify events a bit, but anyway, after the Goths fought for the Romans tried to cheat them out of their land that they were promised. So the Goths raised their arms up in revolt. In revolt against the Romans. Basically, and they elected Alaric as their king. Alaric likely being a noble and someone who was, okay, that's dangerous, skull for a reason. Alaric being someone who was well respected, a noble, a leader of men, and the Goths, who once again the Romans consider barbarians, revolted against the Romans who were trying to cheat them out of their land, and Alaric's demands were basically, we want the land you promised us and some money. And they never changed, by the way. Like, Alaric basically just kept asking for the land they promised and some money. He wasn't asking for anything unreasonable, just exactly what the Goths were, well, literally promised by the Romans for their military service. And Honorius just refused to give him it, even after it became clear that the Romans were losing the war. And they were losing the war in part because of Honorius's own actions. Honorius had the wives and children of the Goths who stayed loyal to Rome killed. Not Goths who worked for Alaric, because obviously their wives and children were protected by an army of Goths. but specifically the Goths who stayed loyal to Rome. In this case, all Alaric was asking for was what the people promised him, and Honorius in response was basically prolonging a pointless war and attacking people who were on his side. So in this case, the barbarian was very much the more civilized person. Or rather, that is the better person than the person who was more civilized. Oh, these guys are glowing. Okay, anyway, so that's one of the big themes of Howard's Sword and Sorcery works. The hypocrisy of civilization. And that gets me to another part. Sword and Sorcery could be considered a subgenre of dark fantasy, albeit on the lighter side. Sword and Sorcery very often explores the darker side of humanity, and does it to a great extent, and I honestly think it does a better job of it than things like Game of Thrones, because, like, Game of Thrones is specifically a criticism of the Middle Ages, and it often exaggerates the Middle Ages by doing so, like, makes things worse than they actually were in the Middle Ages to criticize them. It's more of a straw man than anything else, in many ways, whereas Robert E. Howard's Conan stories are a criticism of all of civilization, making them far more universal in their applicability. And Howard also includes corruption he saw in his own life in his stories, which, and while that might be, okay, sorry for the interruption, anyway, and while that might be a bit too on the nose for some people, and I'm not going to say you shouldn't be on the nose for you, I don't think it's unreasonable to think it's, like, on the nose and such, but anyway, the Conan, is it? Yeah, like, I don't think it's unreasonable to see it as on the nose, but anyway, Howard did include some things he saw in real life in it, and it shows the universality of Howard's stuff. Like, for example, if I remember right, Howard saw a news story featuring some corrupt cops, and he decided to apply it to his own story with having Conan deal with and love his story with a few corrupt city guards. Though, I would also like to note that Howard puts a bit of nuance, so to speak, in them. Like, so, sort of. You have, in the story, you have multiple corrupt cops in it, but, and some of them, and basically Conan is accused of a crime that he didn't commit, although he was, to be fair to them, he was on his way to commit a different crime. But what I am saying is that, let's see, Conan was on his way to committing a different crime all the while, but he's accused, and it seems that most of the cops just want to pin the crime on him, whereas another of them is basically like, I don't want to do it if I don't have to, but someone has to pay for it, like a priest was killed. I need to pin this on someone. But basically still corrupt, but at least more sympathetic than the others, because he's at least trying to do his job there. Anyway, so anyway, basically, the hypocrisy of civilization is often a theme in Sword and Sorcery, at least in Howard's work. Not all Sword and Sorcery stories have it as a theme, or even need it as a theme, but it's a fairly common theme for a reason. Anyway, so Sword and Sorcery is a part of the dark fantasy genre, like Berserk is, like A Song of Ice and Fire is. However, I think one of the other things that differentiates it from other parts of the dark fantasy genre is, in, like, simple terms, that the heroes. So Sword and Sorcery heroes tend to have similar things to them, and this can pretty heavily vary. Like, there are multiple things that go into making a good Sword and Sorcery hero. But generally speaking, there are a few similarities. So, First off, sword and sorcery heroes are often larger than life. Like, Conan has more in common with Guts than he has with someone like, say, Ned Stark or Jon Snow. Sure, like, Jon Snow is a tough guy, but he can who can pretty easily fight 3 guys at... Well, sorry, who... Not easy... Okay. Jon Snow is fairly tough, and in the books, he can take on, like, 3 guys at once. And he needs to in order to make it a challenge at the Night's Watch, unless he's up against someone else who's really tough. However, Jon Snow is ultimately not able to beat 6 guys. Beating 6 guys would basically be fairly impossible at once for a human, but Conan can do it. Well, unless the 6 guys are just suck, and it depends on a lot of factors like circumstance and such, but Conan could beat anyone in A Song of Ice and Fire in single combat. Like, I seriously don't think there's a single person there who could beat him in single combat, even if it's like an unfair fight. Like, in The Phoenix and the Sword, it takes 20 guys jumping a half-armored Conan to get to the verge of killing him. And that's Conan in his old age. Now, in younger Conan stories, it does depict him as being at risk of being overwhelmed with numbers with smaller amounts. So, experience is definitely playing a role here. However, the general point still stands, that Conan is capable of accomplishing far more than guys like Jon Snow is. Like, now, he isn't on Guts' level of power, but he is definitely further, like, more powerful than people who are on, like, Game of Thrones level, or most of the player characters in Warhammer Fantasy in the Warhammer Fantasy tabletop RPG. He's more like the characters although there are characters in Warhammer who are more powerful than Conan, easily more, but typically when people think of low fantasy and dark fantasy, they think of guys who are well within the level of humanity, or just barely above by fiction standards, your average human. By fiction standards, not by real standards. Conan is, and sword and sorcery heroes, generally speaking, are either at the absolute peak of what a human can accomplish, or they're slightly superhuman. So, yeah, so basically, that's not a part of it. The heroes are larger than life in sword and sorcery. However, while the heroes are larger than life, there are certain similarities a lot of them share. For one thing, they're not necessarily nice guys, or... Now, this can vary. Conan himself in the books, if you read them in the order of when they take place, rather than like how they were written or just randomly, Conan basically goes from someone who is more or less lawful evil. Maybe you could even argue that he's neutral evil, but he's definitely evil in the earliest books, to someone who is lawful good. So Conan goes through quite a lot of character development. With most of the books, he's somewhere in between those alignments, depending on when they take place in his life. But Conan was all sorts of horrible stuff, like a pirate, like a pirate, a like a pirate, a reaver, raider, thief. So I don't really. So like, sword and sorcery heroes are very rarely outright nice guys or of a normal heroic sort. So, like, they quite often, at the very least, have something of an edge to them. They're not all of them are necessarily outright evil, but they can get to similar level. Like, they're not necessarily always outright evil, but they're rarely fully good people either. Like, Elric of Melbourne is not exactly a nice person. Red Sonja herself, from what I haven't seen much of Red Sonja, but from what I know of her, her typical depictions show her as generally heroic, but with some at least somewhat selfish motivations and mostly just doing what she wants, which is fairly similar to Conan's typical depictions, including his depictions by Howard. Okay. So, yeah, like we have the, but anyway, so a Sword and Sorcery heroes that, like, an example of this I think that's pretty good is Conan and Valeria in the Red Nails story. So in Red Nails, Conan and Valeria basically go into this city, and they meet some of these inhabitants of this city. And the inhabitants basically go, hey, our evil enemy has been like attacking us all the time, has been attacking us constantly. We've been in a basically long war where many have died. And then Conan and Valeria are like, okay, how is that our problem? And then the people in the city are like, okay, we are also very wealthy and we can pay you to fight for us. Then Conan and Valeria are like, okay, it is now officially our problem. So, yeah. Yeah, basically, to put things in simple terms, yeah, Sword and Sorcery heroes often have selfish motivations. And some of them are outright evil. That being said, there are a few rules about writing Sword and Sorcery heroes. You can't make them too evil, obviously, or like when you're writing a villain protagonist, you have to be careful because you can't make them too evil, or the audience won't like them. Like, or at least won't, or no wait, you can make them. Yeah, you can make them evil, but all right. So Walter White is an example of this. You don't want Walter White to win at the end of Breaking Bad. You want him to get justice for his crimes. With like, who was it? Oh yeah, with Dexter from the show of the same name, even if he is more just than, like, throughout a lot of it than most serial killers, even if he only targets other serial killers, he's still a serial killer, and you don't want him to win over the police at the end of the day. You still want him to face justice. So, but with the Sword and Sorcery story, you want the protagonist to win at the end, even if they're someone who is generally evil. So how evil is too evil? Well, the answer is actually fairly simple. More evil than the villain. Like, ultimately, even if your protagonist in a Sword and Sorcery story is evil, they have to be better than the guy they're fighting. Like, Conan might be a reaver, he might be like a thief, a reaver, a pirate, but he's at least not, but he's at least honest about it. Peleus in the Scarlet Citadel might be an evil necromancer, but he's at least human. He's not some half-demon monstrosity. And I could go on, but the basic principle applies. Your Sword and Sorcery hero can be evil. They just have to be a better person than whoever they're up against. Like they have to be less evil than their enemy in the story. And that can mean they're like generally a nice guy but with selfish motives, or they're flat out evil. But also, it should be noted that in Howard E. Howard stories, he does give Conan a sense of honor, albeit a very loose, barbaric sense of honor that is perfectly fine with things like raiding and pillaging, but Conan still has a sense of honor. Like, to give some idea, Conan doesn't really like hurting women. He'll generally do it, like, he'll do it if he has to, but he generally prefers to avoid hurting women if he can. Which is, honestly, kind of accurate to what the old Norse were like in some ways. In some ways, not always. But anyway, so Conan Conan generally tries to avoid, prefers not to hurt women. And he also doesn't break his word. Conan will keep his word no matter what. Also, Conan, if you're a friend of Conan's, Conan will do everything in his power to protect you if you're in danger. So Conan is still better than a lot of people that he fights against, even when he's at his worst. And yeah, but Sword and Sorcery protagonists, generally speaking, they can be fairly evil, but they have to be better than whoever they're up against. So yeah, I think these are like the main things that make the Sword and Sorcery genre, or at least some of them. You have an exploration of the darker elements of humanity. You have you have an exploration of the darker elements of humanity. You have a dark fantasy. Well, a general. Well, it isn't as dark as certain dark fantasy settings are, but it's definitely dark fantasy. So you have dark fantasy. You have the heroes who are larger than life, but aren't necessarily nice people. But even if they aren't, they're at least better than whoever they're fighting against. So yeah, you have various heroes who aren't necessarily nice people. You have generally dark fantasy setting, larger than life heroes, and an exploration of like many of the darker sides of humanity. And Howard's faces an outright criticism of the hypocrisy of civilization. So anyway, so yeah, like and also magic being something that is quite often, not necessarily always, but is often evil. Yeah, and I think that's just how does it for the overview of Sword and Sorcery. Thank you for watching. Thank you for watching, everyone, and remember to like, comment, and subscribe.